When thinking of different genres of anything, certain prominent settings come to mind. For example, when you think of sci-fi, you think of deep space. Superhero films, Vancouver. Western horror, cabin in the woods at night. But Japanese horror, however, is usually set in broad daylight in at least a village that has a population. If you've seen more than one horror anime at all, it is highly probable that at least one of them was set in a small village kind of setting. Most of the good ones are anyways, like Higurashi, Shiki, and Mayoiga. Most people will assume that the reason for this setting being so prominent in Japanese horror is because their horror focuses more on denying you any safe zones at all than Western horror does, which is why much of it takes place during daytime and actually in populated areas, rather than dark, isolated woods or cabins. But this assumption is wrong. The reasoning actually goes much, much deeper than that. Take the previously mentioned Higurashi as an example. A city boy comes to town and immediately witnesses strange things going on. From carrying just a plain suspicious weapon in a remote location, attempted murder, an urban legend about a corpse being chopped up and hidden in packages, and something mysterious going on with the village's leading families. To the uneducated viewer, this may seem as a pretty standard horror series setup, but if you know anything about Japanese history, it should be immediately clear to you why the series is in the setting that it is, and what it wants to say about Japan with it. Cut to 1853, and the US Navy Commodore Matthew C. Perry smashes through the seas with his course set for Japan to drag the country into the modern world, kicking and screaming. And after a while, the screaming of the country had stopped, and most had come to accept the changes in the country. But there was still a group of people who rejected the new changes implemented by both outside influence and the new constitutional monarchic government. This group of people were the samurais, great houses of skilled warriors who until recently had a pretty big sway in Japanese politics. This doesn't mean that they rejected everything modern outright though, as they too were pretty big on the whole firearms thing, but influence of modern ideology and culture had to be rejected at all costs. In the end, of course, the samurai were defeated, and Japan would become the dominant industrial power in the Far East for the first half of the 20th century. This is, of course, represented clearly through the city boy coming into conflict with the leading families of the rural village, and their extreme protectionism of their own, and not letting anyone leave. Later on, a scientific institute also meddles greatly with these elders. They have with them a private army and all of the wonders of modern technology, making the allegory even more obvious. Through this, it is clear that the reason that so many horror stories in Japan are set in rural villages is that what the modern Japanese nation fears the most is simple rural folk who won't conform to their hyper-modern economy, industry, and way of life with all the foreign, interfering gadgets that get in the way of things. It's not a coincidence that the protagonist of this particular story is an outsider who experiences weird and scary phenomena when first arriving in the village. With this motive in mind, one mustn't forget the events that happened right before Japan lost her position as sole industrial power in the East as well. Yes, those events. It's clear throughout the anime that that's an element of the horror as well, with for example the massacre of the village mirroring that of the Japanese doings west of their wholesome little island. I mean, seeing as the horror in the anime, as well as the villains from an historical perspective, is meant to be the great families of Hinamizawa, it is clear that the good guys here are supposed to be the soldiers massacring the village and ridding the nation of its horrors. And if this truly does mirror the events in China that inspired it, then we can also gain some insight into who the good guys of that conflict were as well. Like, can you really blame someone for wanting to have some fun and ravage the land west of them? Some other pointers to the horror in the series having basis in the Second World War instead of what fans of Japanese horror would tell you can be found in multiple places that swirl together. The fact that Hitler is clearly alive in the universe of Higurashi is one of them, in addition to the giant underground bunker that the Sonosakis have in their possession, clearly being remnants of the Japanese fear of nuclear weapons after World War II. Though I do wonder what they can use it for nowadays. Wait. Come to think of it, in the only short appearance of Hitler in the anime, he is buying poisonous gas. So he must clearly be up to something. I mean, this is a horror story after all. Oh wait. Oh no, oh gosh darn it. Mayoiga is one of the other anime I mentioned earlier. The deal with this one is that a lot of the people who watched it ended up disliking it heavily for how almost intentionally bad it seemed. What these people don't realize though, is that Mayoiga is a parody of the kinds of anime that take place in village settings with something spooky to them, by taking the piss out of them, and thus invalidating their outlook on the rural population of Japan as the enemy of the state in the process. What's sad about this is that since most people who watched this thought of this anime as trash, or didn't get this point out of it at all, it shows that the outlook on this rural population by the modern state of Japan has spread to the West as well through these horror anime that it's making fun of. This propaganda is probably doing its job well in Japan as well, and that just saddens me. Though speaking of how people receive an anime like this brings me to the final anime I mentioned earlier, Shiki. A while ago, I made an unscripted rant where I said that I didn't understand why so many people were defending the guys in a show that literally kill the innocent inhabitants of the village there to replace them with themselves. But with this revelation of how the Japanese government wishes to portray these communities, it is no longer a wonder why so many people are taking the side of the murderous monsters rather than the rural population. Gosh darn it. I hate this. So, what did we learn today? There is no hope in the world if everyone are so easily swayed by this Nipponese propaganda. I urge you all to be smarter than so, and do what you can to go against this massive tide of evil, but not to become depressed if all your efforts against it bear no fruit. Surely no good would come out of that. Have a good day.
ラズベリーヘブン迎えに来たの優しい